Hello, welcome to Dan Explains It All. Today we're here to talk about Visitor. Visitor is a parallel multi-modulator, which means it's two modulations in parallel, pretty much. But it's probably going to sound a little different from what you're imagining. A little bit of push-pull, a little bit of added delay, a little bit of more than just two things in parallel to each other. So let's get into it. We're going to start with the primary voice. So if I turn the secondary knob all the way down, I get just the one modulation, the primary. Let's do some knobs at noon. I'll take the Regen all the way down. So this primary toggle represents three different voices for that primary modulation. There's a tremolo, that's T, chorus is C, phaser is P. Let's check out the P mode first. Now if I take my mix control all the way down, I'm just going to hear the dry signal. Pretty much the same, on or off. If I go all the way to the right, I only hear the wet signal. And with a phaser, that sounds kind of like a vibe. It has a bit of that vibrato sound to it. A bit of pitch shifting rather than just frequency changes. So I'll set the mix at 50-50 for kind of a classic phaser sound. Let's check out the range of the rate control. You can get pretty slow when it's all the way down, and pretty fast when it's all the way up. So I'm going to set it pretty much just in the middle, and then we can hear what the depth control does. The depth control will get very shallow all the way down, and so you just hear a little bit of phasing happening. And then as I bring it up, the LFO gets wider, peaks get higher, valleys get lower, until we have a really deep phaser swoosh. I'm going to slow it down a bit so you can really hear it turning around. Now's probably a good time to talk about the Regen control. So basically Regen is just feedback. It's taking the output of the phaser, or whatever the modulation is, and feeding it back in at the start. And what that does on a phaser is it just enhances those frequency shifts. So every element of it just sounds a little bit more intense as you turn it up. If we go to a really goofy setting, it's just totally out of control. Regen all the way down, still pretty out of control, honestly, but less so. So again, putting our knobs at noon, I'll take the Regen all the way down. Let's check out the chorus mode. So you can hear kind of a similar rate and depth setting, just with a new voice, a chorus instead of a phaser. Same deal where it gets pretty out of control. Or pretty subtle. And you may know this already, but when you've got a full 100% wet option on a chorus, you get a true pitch vibrato. So if I max out the mix, I get that really seasick, not even chorus, just true vibrato sound. So the last mode in the primary modulation is tremolo. And the controls are essentially the same, but just a little bit different. So basically with a tremolo, the thing that's setting your depth is the amount of mix. So depth and mix kind of become the same thing. So for tremolo mode, mix control acts as depth control. And it's also, the wet signal is like very slightly delayed from the dry, so you get a bit of frequency cancellation, and it kind of creates a different sound from a standard tremolo when the mix is about 50-50. So now you're probably thinking, what does the depth knob do if the mix is the depth? Depth now is the intensity of the shape of the tremolo. So basically, all the way to the left is a sine wave tremolo. And I'll go ahead and max out the mix so you can really hear this difference. As I bring the depth up, you'll hear it get choppier and choppier until it's practically a square wave at the top of the sweep. Bring up up the rate. Doesn't quite hit the ring mod thing, but just gets a really fast, super choppy tremolo. And the regen control, you might be thinking, I've never seen a feedback control on a tremolo, and that's a good thing because it just gets out of control and distorted because there's no real delay or frequency shifting elements. So what we did for the feedback of the tremolo is we added just a slight delay, so it doesn't immediately feed back, it feeds back just a little bit later. So it still stretches out and makes the sound more intense, but just in a way that honestly sounds a little bit different from a standard tremolo. And it also enhances, it basically creates a little comb filter, kind of an almost flangery sound, just because of the stacking of that slightly delayed feedback. So that's the primary modulation. You get it. It's modulation, there's a feedback control, very accessible. Now let's have some fun. So the secondary modulation has only two controls. There's a toggle switch and a knob. The toggle sets the voice between either tremolo, T, or chorus, C. And the secondary knob does just all kinds of stuff all at once. So like at the start of this, if I turn the secondary all the way down, it goes away entirely. As I start to bring it up, the first thing that comes in is the volume of the secondary modulation. So you hear it start to enter. And again, these modulations are in parallel. So rather than the secondary happening after the primary, they're just happening alongside each other. And as I continue to turn the knob up, I also increase the depth and rate of that secondary modulation. Or I should say the depth and the max rate. We'll get to that in a little bit. And then as I continue to push it up, it also adds a little bit of a delay offset between the primary and secondary. So when I max out this secondary knob, you'll actually hear a delayed signal, and that's the secondary just getting fully delayed from the primary. So it gets just extra washy, not messy, but just lush and kind of extra from what you would expect from just two modulations in parallel. So let's check out a phaser as my primary modulation, and a tremolo as my secondary. Listen closely to the rate of that tremolo. So that's what I was talking about, where the secondary knob sets the maximum rate. That's because the primary modulation, whatever LFO is affecting that, so in this case the wave that's turning the phaser up and down, is also pushing and pulling on the rate of the secondary LFO. So that tremolo gets faster when the phaser is hitting its peak, and it gets slower when the phaser is hitting its valley. So you just get this extra push-pull where even though the audio signals are in parallel, they're still interacting with each other in an interesting way. Knowing that, let's hear a chorus as a primary with a chorus as a secondary. So here you hear a lot of different pitch modulations happening. You've got essentially your main signal and then two pitch vibratos that are pushing and pulling on each other. Just really lush. And I should talk about how the mix control is a master mix. So again, if I turn it all the way down, it's dry signal again. If I turn it all the way up, we hear both modulations in parallel with no dry signal at all. So basically it's dry and wet. There's no mix between the two modulations. They're just riding along together as long as that secondary knob is up. The other master control in Visitor is Regen. So this is a master feedback control. So think about your whatever instrument you're playing going into the pedal and then splitting into two paths. The first one is going to hit the primary modulation. The second one, simultaneously, is going to hit the secondary modulation. Then they both get added, and that gets sent to the output of the pedal. So that's parallel routing. we've talked about the difference between series and parallel before. That's simple parallel routing. With this regen control, this feedback control, what you're doing is you're taking that output where they've been added together and bringing it right back around to the start. So it gets split again, which means that the output of your secondary feeds back into the secondary and also into the primary. Output of the primary feeds back into the primary and also into the secondary. So I've talked about it a lot, but maybe we should just hear what happens when you max that regen. Now, even though the paths are theoretically in parallel, there's also this series element where they're feeding back across each other. Bring the mix back a little bit, maybe up the rate. So here's where things get really washy. Just to remind you what this loop sounds like. And then with visitor. So there's a lot of different voices here. There's accessible, sort of familiar modulation sounds of phaser, chorus, tremolo. And there's that secondary parallel sound, and then there's the ability to delay that and to feed them back and forth into each other. And there's just a lot you can find in Visitor that I hope is surprising. And that's it. That's Visitor. It's a soft touch switch that handles the true bypass switching. 9 volts center negative DC power, about 46 milliamps, so it's not super power hungry. There's an expression control. The expression control is attached to that secondary knob, so you can use an expression slider or expression pedal to just blend in that secondary and then blend it right back out for a more standard modulation sound. You can get weird pitch shifty effects as you move that around. So to control that with your foot would be a lot of fun.